Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. Tonight we're going to be looking at the fourth chapter of the book of Lamentations, and it's our fourth acrostic poem in the book. So the first two chapters of Lamentations are 22 verse acrostics corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 3 is 66 verses long because each acrostic bit is 3 lines. So 3 verses of the first letter of the alphabet, 3 verses of the second letter of the alphabet, and so on and so forth. And so much of this book, as its name suggests, is very, very mournful and sad. And we've talked a bit about how this book reflects a lot of the collective trauma of the people of Israel around the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and how that's not just about a physical place or simply an experience of war, but it's the complete destruction of their entire way of life, their entire way of being, and everything that they thought they knew or thought they believed about how the world worked in terms of who God is, who their God is in relation to other gods, or whether or not there even are other gods, and all of that sort of thing. So there's so much of that really visceral trauma in these verses. And so we talked about that even in relation to Jesus and how Jesus comes into that world of exile, even though it's about 500 years after the book of Lamentations is written. The people of Israel are still living with that trauma as they're occupied by Rome. So even though they're back in the land, they're back in Jerusalem, the temple has been rebuilt, and it's precious to them, they're still under Roman rule. But when Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, and claims that that's going to happen, that is such a sore spot. And Lamentations gives us a glimpse into why that's such a sore spot for the Jewish leaders. So we're going to look at chapter 4 now, and it's again another acrostic, and we will see how we get on. But I'll read through it. I'll make a couple of comments here or there, and then there's one sort of main point that I want to tie in to this chapter as we get through. So let us begin. How the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. The sacred stones lie scattered at the head of every street. The precious children of Zion, worth their weight in fine gold, how they are reckoned as earthen pots, the work of a potter's hands. In this talk of gold versus earthen pots are very cheap to make and they don't necessarily last very long. But gold and implements made of gold are durable and they last, are also beautiful and precious. So that's that distinction they're making. Even the jackals offer the breast and nurse their young, but my people has become cruel, like the ostriches in the wilderness. And this is a really interesting verse here. The word for ostriches there, like some bits of ancient Hebrew, we don't really know exactly how to translate it. So there's 3 or 4 words here or there scattered throughout the Old Testament. It's not very common, but it happens, where it's this word of ancient Hebrew that we have a sense of what it is, but we don't really know. So there's only one other time that ostriches are mentioned in the Old Testament, and that's in the book of Job, but it's a different word. And ostriches were animals that existed in the wilderness. Some translation suggestions might be an eagle owl here for ostrich, but the reason that most translations will go with ostrich, because it does make sense and it is where we're going, is that ostriches lay eggs and bury them in the sand and leave their young to go and hunt. So they don't sit and watch their young with a watchful eye. So the distinction that the author here is making is even the jackals of the desert are nursing their young, but the sins of Israel, the sins of the people, they are like the ostriches in the wilderness who leave their young like an ostrich does. So that's why we have the word ostrich there, which is interesting to me. And then we're going to get some very visceral language here. So just as a bit of a warning for those who are listening in, the next wee bit is quite graphic. So if that's the kind of thing that might be upsetting to you, go ahead and feel free to mute me. Verse 4. The tongue of the infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives them anything. Those who feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple cling to ash heaps. You see all these distinctions, the gold and the earthen pots, the delicacies and the begging for food, the jackal and ostrich and all of this, and purple and ashes, all of these contrasts to before when the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Israel was rich. For the chastisement of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, though no hand was laid on it. Her princes were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their bodies were more ruddy than coral, their hair like sapphire. Now their visage is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become dry as wood. Again, this image of the heat and the hunger and the pain that the people are experiencing. Happier were those pierced by the sword than those pierced by hunger, whose life drains away, deprived of the produce of the field. The hands of the compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food in the destruction of my people. And the really graphic image there is that for a mother, it's better to end your child's life compassionately than to watch them starve to death slowly. That is not a situation anyone should ever be in. And this graphic image, whether or not that was actually what was taking place or not, the image there is really gets at that visceral pain and trauma that people were feeling at this time, and the way that the situation was so painful and dire for those who were left in Jerusalem. They became their food in the destruction of my people. Verse 11, the Lord gave full vent to his wrath. He poured out his hot anger and kindled a fire in Zion that consumed its foundations. The kings of the earth did not believe, nor did any of the inhabitants of the world, that foe or enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. It was for the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests who shed the blood of the righteous in the midst of her. Blindly they wandered through the streets, so defiled with blood that no one was able to touch their garments. Away, unclean, people shouted at them. Away, away, do not touch. So they became fugitives and wanderers. It was said among the nations, they shall stay here no longer. The Lord himself has scattered them. He will regard them no more. No honor was shown to the priests, no favor to the elders. Our eyes failed, ever watching vainly for help. We were watching eagerly for a nation that could not save. They dogged our steps so that we could not walk in our streets. Our end drew near, our days were numbered, for our end had come. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles in the heavens. They chased us on the mountains. They lay in wait for us in the wilderness. The Lord's anointed, the breath of our life, was taken in their pits. The one of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. And that's likely a reference to the king of the time. The Lord's anointed would have been the king. We do often see that in the Old Testament, want to jump to thinking about Jesus as the anointed one, but here it's probably just referencing the king who was the anointed one. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter Edom, that you live in the land of Uz. But to you also the cup shall pass. You shall become drunk and strip yourself bare. And this reference here, Uz is the land where Abraham was from, but also Edom and the Edomites are an interesting people. We have in the story of the forefathers of Israel, there is Isaac and Ishmael as two half-brothers from whom two nations spring, the Ishmaelites and then the nation of Israel. But the Edomites are actually the descendants of Esau, who is Jacob's older brother. And remember, Jacob steals his father's blessing from Esau. And so the Edomites were sort of a constant rival and enemy to the Israelites when they were in the land. And there's this sort of back and forth between the Israelites and the Edomites. And there's that historic sort of rivalry that goes back to Jacob and Esau. But throughout all of the history of Israel, the Edomites are kind of there And sometimes they're friends, but often they're enemies. And at this time, and we see this also in Psalm 137, there's reference to the Edomites, that what we think is going on politically at this time is that the Edomites were maybe supposed to be Israel's ally, but their main ally at the time that Babylon is coming to conquer is Egypt. Israel is allied to Egypt, and they're hoping for an army to come up from Egypt and help them fight Babylon. But remember, also Assyria has come down in all of this, and so Edom was vassal to Assyria, and then when Babylon comes and conquers Assyria, then Edom apparently was maybe going to ally with Israel, but eventually lays down and either allies with Babylon or just lays idly by as Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon come through and destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and really just ransack all of the nation of Judah and Israel. And so what this is referencing is, be glad and rejoice, O daughter Edom, that you live in the land of Uz, but to you also the cup shall pass and you shall become drunk. So it's this angry, like, okay, you watched us get destroyed, but you're going to get destroyed too. There's kind of a vindictive feeling towards Edom. And then the last verse is one of maybe the more hopeful verses in the entire book of Lamentations. The punishment of your iniquity, O daughter Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer, but your iniquity, O daughter Edom, he will punish. He will uncover your sins. So again, that frustration with the nation of Edom. But again, back to that hope that the exile will not last forever. And that leads to kind of the main point that I want to take away from this chapter is I feel like this is quite an interesting idea. If we think about this psychologically, what is a more difficult thought to accept? If you are living as the Israelites were with the temple system, the sacrificial system, you're living under the law, you have your whole history that you can trace your lineage back to Abraham and maybe beyond, and you tell yourself the story, you live the festivals, and you do all of the temple rituals, and if you live in Jerusalem, you're there all the time, but if you're not, you might come for Passover and all of these things, and your God is God. You've seen David and Solomon and the splendor of these kingdoms, and all of this to you is true, that your God is God in the entire world, the greatest God there is, or maybe even the only God there is, depending on what their thinking is. There's some debate at what point in history they switched from seeing Yahweh God as the greatest of all of the gods to then seeing Yahweh God as the only God that exists, and the other gods are merely idols. There's a bit of a shift in tone throughout the centuries of the Old Testament. But what is more difficult to accept? That none of that is true. That God is not the most powerful, or maybe even doesn't exist. Your God didn't come and save you. None of it was real. Your whole life is a lie. Or is it in some ways almost easier to accept the idea that your God is still the most powerful God? Your God is the greatest God. But you have sinned, and therefore that God is punishing you. And so therefore that God is still righteous, still great, still the most powerful in the land. And all of that is still true. But you have sinned, and therefore you are being punished. And I think, especially for these people at this time, it is almost easier to get your head around psychologically and maybe emotionally the idea that all of it is still true, but your God is just angry with you, rather than resorting to maybe a more objectionable way of seeing it, which is that all of it was wrong and your God wasn't actually the greatest God, and that the gods of the Babylonians are actually greater than your God. And so I think that gives us maybe a bit of a glimpse into how they were seeing their situation, that they don't abandon their worship of God, and they are able to reflect and see the way that their prophets and their priests had exploited the people and exploited the systems for their own gain, and actually turned the law and turned the systems on their head and made it about profit and exploitation rather than the worship of God. And so they're able to hold on to this notion of the worship of God and the truth of their history without just going into oh, it was all a lie, oh, we abandoned it all. They actually hold on to it really strongly, and there's evidence to suggest that, and this makes sense again psychologically, that the Israelites in Babylon actually hold even tighter to the idea of the law and the worship of God and all of the rituals than people who are back in Jerusalem amongst the destruction of everything. So I think that's a really interesting mindset, an interesting thing for us to kind of reflect on as we think about the way in which bits of the Old Testament, bits of even the New Testament express an idea of an angry, wrathful God who metes out punishment and destruction and all of that. And whether or not that is something that we see actually in the character of God or something that makes sense as we reflect on events, and whether or not it's easier for us to think of a God who's still in control but angry with us and punishing us than it is to think of the notion that we got God wrong entirely. And I think often it's easier for us to accept an angry and vengeful God who is still adhering to what we think God is, rather than a God who is defying our expectations. So that's kind of where I want us to kind of think around that idea from Lamentations chapter 4. We'll come back next week and we'll finish off the book of Lamentations, and we'll see this last chapter, which is in fact not an acrostic, but again, poetic in nature. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming along for the ride through Lamentations, and we'll be back next week. Thanks, everyone.